Well, this morning we want to kind of wrap up our series on the power of song. We've spent a number of Sundays exploring different aspects of our singing. And today I want to talk about, not specifically song, but related. I want to talk about sincere worship. And in the text that Ethan just read for us, Jesus tells the Samaritan woman that the time is coming when we are to worship in spirit and in truth, which means that actually there's something a whole lot more profound going on here than merely the external part. And I realize it's easy to jump to the wrong conclusions when we think about worship. If we're not careful, we might equate outward expression with depth of worship. A great question for all of us, which has absolutely nothing to do with performance or outward expression, is that question: how sincere is our worship? We've all probably been guilty at one time or another of sitting through a church service and mouthing the words of some song without thinking about the significance of the words or being mindful of the one to whom we address them. I know if I don't watch myself, we're not using hymnals anymore, so that helps. But I can remember sitting and singing one verse in melody and one verse in bass and one verse in tenor and paying attention to how well I was harmonizing. Wow. Harmonizing is good, but it's actually not the main point here. Or how often are we distracted and our minds wander during prayer? I think that's a favorite tactic of the devil, to have me thinking about other things. Worship is intended to focus on God, to proclaim His praise, to exalt Him, and to adore Him. And yes, at times our worship is corporate and public, the way it is now, this morning, especially when we gather as a community of faith. And at times it's also personal and very private. It is both. Jesus told the Samaritan woman at the well, "An hour is coming and now is when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." That was not meant just for her. It applies to all of us. To worship in spirit means we can worship anywhere and everywhere. And by the way, my preference would be that you have your eyes open if you're praying while you're driving your car. And I won't go into the reasons. I think you can figure it out. But there's nothing wrong with praying while you drive your car, as long as it's not keeping you from paying attention to where you're going. Our bodies are the temple of the living God, and He lives within us. And this morning in Sunday school, we talked about it is not Jesus and you, it is Jesus in you. It is Jesus in us. When we worship in spirit and in truth, we worship with sincerity, without pretense or hypocrisy. And it's actually that personal aspect of our relationship with God in Christ Jesus that enables us to worship with sincerity in a corporate setting. So it's the personal relationship with God that comes first, and that then enables me to worship in a corporate setting. And yes, God instituted the local church, and He fully intends for us to gather and to worship corporately, to adore Him, express our praise to Him publicly, and to do it with pure and sincere hearts. But, here's the but. As we've been talking about the power of song, maybe you don't share a love for song. You might be someone who patiently endures the singing on Sunday morning, waiting to hear the message. We're all different. We look, talk, behave, and think differently from one another. We have different gifts, talents, abilities. We have unique fingerprints, DNA, pet peeves, quirks, personalities. And we all see the world through a unique perspective. We all have a unique shape: spiritual gifts, heart, abilities, personality, and experiences. We're all a collection. And I sometimes say that all of us are dragging an anchor through life, which is our past experiences. It's part of us. God created us all with certain personalities and spiritual temperaments. which then also make us gravitate to certain styles or types of spiritual practices. And yet, in the midst of all that, God invites us to freely worship according to the way He has made us. I'd like to introduce you this morning to the concept of spiritual pathways or sacred pathways, and you'll notice there's a QR code in your bulletin as well. Please don't do it while we're sitting here this morning. You can do it later. But it's a test, online test that you can do with your phone to see which of the pathways resonates with you. A spiritual pathway is the way a person most naturally connects with God and grows spiritually. The Bible seems to identify 7 to 9 different or distinct spiritual pathways, and yet each of us is likely a unique combination of some of these different pathways to relating to Him. You and I can identify our spiritual pathway and then use practices that come naturally to that pathway as a preferred or more meaningful way to connect with God. And as I've suggested, we don't necessarily have just one pathway. Most of us have a natural disposition, however, in our relation to God. So I want to walk through 7 very quickly this morning and explain them to you. And then this afternoon, after your nap, you can take out your phone and pull up that QR code and do the test and see which one it is. And probably when you do it and you look at it, you say, that makes sense. That's who I am. So the first one is the relational pathway. And probably if we want to look for biblical examples, we would pick Peter or Barnabas. This is your pathway of spiritual growth comes most naturally when you're involved with people. And God speaks to you through significant relationships. You love to be around others, and time alone can drive you crazy. Again, Peter and Paul might be examples. Peter came to Jesus with others, and he was part of an inner circle with James and John. The defining moments in his life, his decision to follow Christ, his confession of Jesus as Messiah, his denial of Jesus, his restoration, they all took place in a relational context. So that might be your pathway. There's also an intellectual pathway. The second pathway, intellectual. And you guessed it, Paul might be a good example of this pathway. If this is your pathway, if you draw close to God, you draw close to Him as you learn more about Him. You're a thinker, and you come alive in a class or with a great book because the road to your heart is through your head. We did the spiritual pathways exercise as part of our young adults group, and Lyndall Fast, the assistant pastor in Kleefeld, and myself both ended up on this one. We both found ourselves to be, this is our pathway. When I read a deep book like Gregory Boyd and discover something I hadn't seen before, it just makes me feel closer to God. That's your preferred pathway. The study of Scripture and theology comes natural to you, and it really stimulates you. Obviously, the Apostle Paul had an intellectual pathway. Just look at the book of Romans. Even before his conversion, he studied under Gamaliel, a great Jewish scholar of his day. And after his conversion, Paul went into the synagogues and reasoned from the Scriptures, and then also debated with the philosophers in Athens. It's not hard to see that this is his pathway. A third pathway would be a worship pathway. And here, it's not hard to pick somebody like David. If you have a deep love of corporate worship and celebration, this is your pathway. You may not even be an outgoing person, but during worship, you open your heart and enthusiastically participate. This is your pathway if a corporate praise service is the most healing experience that you can have with God. King David is a great example of someone who had a worship pathway. Remember the text that says that he danced in the streets in worship, he wrote psalms and poetry to God to express his love. That was his predominant pathway. Another pathway we could call the activist pathway. And I think the one that would describe this from Scripture most would be Nehemiah. The activist has single-minded zeal and a strong sense of vision. An activist has a passion to build a church and work for justice in the world. They also work to bring out the potential that God has placed in others. So I think of Barnabas in this case as well. Nehemiah was an activist. He was troubled and depressed when he heard that Jerusalem was in ruins. He prayed, and then he went to the king and said, "Here's the problem. These are my plans. Here's a list of what I need from you, and when can we start?" That's Nehemiah. With an activist, prayer and action go hand in hand. Fifthly, there's the contemplative pathway. And here the two Marys come to mind. A contemplative loves uninterrupted time alone with God, no distractions. Oftentimes, busyness or spending a lot of time with other people can drain a contemplative. Martha's sister Mary seems to have been a contemplative. She didn't care about housework, she just wanted to sit at the feet of Jesus and listen. Mary, the mother of Jesus, also seems to have been a contemplative because she didn't speak much but stored up these things in her heart. Number 6, the service pathway. And some of you are already thinking of Dorcas. If this is you, God's presence seems most tangible to you when you are helping others. You connect with God when you are serving. You would much rather serve than be served. And as I've suggested, a biblical example of this would be Dorcas, who is described in Acts as a woman known for her deeds, that she was about serving. The last one that I want to reference is what I call the naturalist or creation pathway. And Jesus comes to mind here, although he probably practiced every single pathway. The naturalist responds deeply to God through his creation. This is your pathway if being outdoors replenishes you, moves your heart, opens your soul, and strengthens your faith. And when I think of this one, I think of Pastor Mo. I think it's his pathway. I think when he's out on the lake fishing, there's no better place and no greater sense of God's presence. And yes, this would be a real connecting point for me as well. You drink God in through your senses and are often creative yourself. That's not me. Perhaps the best example of this pathway is Jesus. Of course, he exemplifies every pathway, but the Bible portrays Jesus as being especially drawn to nature and to contemplation. He often withdrew from others to be outdoors, going to a lake, to the mountains, or to the wilderness to be with the Father. He always wanted to be in nature and often used aspects of nature in his teaching. Not surprising when he created it all. So I've briefly described 7 different pathways, but we're usually a mixture. We rarely rely on a single approach to connect with God every time. We're more likely to use several. Coming back to Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well in John chapter 4, what we're looking for is sincere worship. Worship that is done in spirit and in truth, not mechanical, not contrived, not forced. Discovering your spiritual pathway, your tendency or inclination to one of the pathways described this morning won't necessarily change you. But understanding this part of the way you are wired might help you to enhance and enrich your practice of worship. And it might also help you to avoid feeling guilty when another pathway just doesn't seem to do it for you in the same way. What we do want is to be participatory in all aspects of our worship together. So I'm pretty sure the praise band isn't terribly excited about leading singing and having nobody respond in song. I had a conversation with Mo after, I think it was our first Sunday on this topic, and standing here during the singing, I had to really reel in my emotions because I was facing a congregation that was singing back in worship, and I had never felt that to that degree because I'm almost always sitting with my back to the congregation. And Mo's response was enlightening because he said, well, it wasn't necessarily more or less than usual, but he could say that because he's often here in front facing the congregation. And I certainly could understand a whole lot better what it meant during COVID to live stream and have no one in the building, and then to try to stand and lead worship when there's nobody in front of you. A totally different experience. So yes, we do want to be participatory. We want to engage. We want to encourage and build one another up, no matter how we are worshiping. And when we do communion, we are worshiping. When we celebrate baptism, we're worshiping. When we have a meal together, we are worshiping. So we need to continue to grow in our worship, both personally and privately, as well as in our public and corporate worship. I'm going to ask Diane to come up and see if there's some questions and responses, and I've also asked Jody Hartung to come up, if you would. Some of you don't know Jody, but Diane threw her under the bus and said she'd be willing to do this. And when I went and asked her, Joel said we actually have to say yes every time we're asked to do something, so he threw her under the bus. And so she's under the bus.
Hi, bus.
I think we forgot to tell the number and remind people that they could, so there are none. So if you have one, you can. But
stand further that way because the mic's going. Okay, so Jody, then let me put you on the spot.
Can you get all three of us in where this far?
Does one of these pathways resonate with you most?
I would say I am the music and creational person.
So that's your
Yes.
pathway.
I struggle to sit silently.
Okay. How about you, Diane?
I'm also the naturalist or the creation. If I'm on the lake and it's just peaceful, I'm good with God right there, walking through the forest. There's my happy place.
And our summer holidays up in Banff?
I met God every day.
I used to tell people in Guadalajara that wanted to come to Canada, I said, fly direct from Puerto Vallarta to Calgary, rent a car, go up to Banff, and by the way, God vacations in Banff, so that you know what you're in for. Kind of tongue-in-cheek, but what a wonderful world, and you see God in it.
Okay, there's a question.
Okay.
Oh, no, there's another one. Okay, let's start with the first one. What is worship, and why do we worship God?
I'm really glad you're up here, Jody.
Well, people. Well, that's what you just explained. Worship is something completely different to each one of us. Like, I'm one of the people that sits here and in worship is crying my eyes out. And the person next to me may not be. And they are the ones that can sit in silence and truly, be filled. But I sit in silence and lose my mind. I get twitchy. And so worship is completely different to each one of us.
So what you're saying, Jody, is that we shouldn't judge a book by its cover. We shouldn't judge you sitting there crying your eyes out or the person sitting next to you visually unmoved and say this one is worshiping and this one isn't.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes, because you sitting there reading Boyd is, Anyway, I have another question.
No judgment.
No judgment.
No judgment, but not. He reads me a paragraph and I'm like, I got nothing. Anyway, the next question is, what if you are bad at all of them? Asking for a friend.
What do you think, Jody?
Okay, I'm going to transfer back into my young child days, where your brain is so full when you're carrying toddlers everywhere that it seems like you're really bad at every single way to worship. But look outside. Wiping the counter if you can hum a song. Obviously, I'm giving you my pathways to do. But you're helping that toddler. And even just speaking words to them, you're teaching them. And if you can have a good attitude, that can be transferred into having the joy of the Lord. So again, I'm more of a, let's try and be worshipful with everything, then I have to have set times. So when I think about the exhausting days of having little kids, and wiping the counter can be the greatest act of service you do in the day. There's such beauty in that.
Okay. we don't have time to unpack this morning, but there's also a desert motif in Scripture. And you'll notice that Jesus went into the desert, was led into the desert before a significant moment. John the Baptist was in the desert before a significant ministry. And there may be moments in your life where you feel spiritually like you're in the desert. And hang in there, because just because you're in the desert today doesn't mean that there's a problem necessarily. God might be preparing you in the desert for something coming down the road. So sometimes you and I find ourselves a little bit in the desert, and so hang on to Christ. Stay the course. I know we think everything should always be wonderful all the time, but we tend to grow more in the valleys than on the mountaintops, and the desert experience sometimes is part of that.
I would also say in that, encourage your neighbor. Encouragement is, surely it slots into one of those forms of worship, but like just giving someone a smile when you're walking on the road can transform someone's complete perspective on what is happening inside of them spiritually. So, yeah. I can't reference the passage off the top of my head, but encourage one another and come alongside.
Well, I think we've made the word worship to what we're doing right here. We worship God when we're in church in the pews. And I think that's what's restricting what is worship and what your pathways are. This is definitely worship. But I shoveled a driveway with church people. There was worship in that if you are focused on the sense of community, the sense of togetherness, the sense of serving one another. That can be worship. I think we've limited what worship is, very much so. Because the next question was, which would kind of, can a pre-believer worship God? And is this a path to Jesus?
That's a great question, and I think conversion. We often think of conversion as somebody doing a hard 180. When sometimes conversion is a little bit more like trying to do a U-ball with a set of trains, like a semi. It's a number of things along the way so where along this path did the person convert, right? So there might be a number of things that happen to that. We've talked here about would it make sense to change the order from believe, behave, and then belong, to saying, can somebody belong at a certain level, and then as they see faith lived out and community lived out, and as they learn about Jesus, then they believe and then they behave. So that might be a way of answering that question. That I know we'd like to say, here are 4 spiritual laws, raise your hand and give mental assent to them, and now you're in. I don't know if it's always that clean.
Andrew, a few weeks ago when you preached on the Samuel story, so this is maybe a reaching reference, but because Samuel was living in a church, so we want to think he was a believer. But he didn't know that was the Lord speaking to him, and he went and asked someone repeatedly. So a pre-believer may just not know that they are actually hearing the Lord's voice and not know how to unpack that. So, like...
Perfect. I like that, Jody.
I like it too.
Yeah.
I like it too.
Yep.
It makes sense to me.
Yep.
I got one more.
What are you doing next Sunday?
Okay. Is there a benefit to trying new pathways? As long as it's not reading Boyd. Is there a benefit to trying a new pathway?
Okay, here's another wonky reference for me. When I walk, that is a lot of my walking time is Jesus time. So often I do walking church services or walking Jesus podcast or just worship music. But this week, 2 times this week, mid-walk, my phone died. And I was like, how am I I got 3 miles to go to get home. This is going to be silent torture. Even though I'm in creation and walking and I'm surrounded by all the things I love, I was actually conditioned to being distracted too. So 2 times this week, I was reminded I actually need the practice of silence. I need the practice of maybe being uncomfortable in what I want my worship time to look like. And the Lord actually taught me something quite interesting both times. Even though I stumbled and struggled my way through.
See, and I'm a creature of habit, so I actually have to change things up. Like, I would read the Bible through in a year, every year for a few years, well, and at a certain point, it becomes a process. So now I've got to change and do something else, because I can fall into a pattern that becomes legalistic and becomes just dry. So I actually, because of the way I'm wired, I actually have to change things up. And one of the things I've started doing lately, if I driving my car to Winnipeg, I've stopped turning the radio on. I turn it on, I look for a song, turn it off. And so now I'm meditating and thinking, and I'm using that time. But we don't like silence, and I've realized actually I need that silence because I need to be thinking and thinking about God. So, thank you, Jody and Diane.
There's more, but we could be here all day.
No, then we better stop and do some more singing. Thank you, both of you. Yeah.